mic. 35th International Webinar of Seshadripuram Evening Degree College in association with the Australian National University, Canberra, Australia, and Flame University, Pune, Maharashtra, India, on Digital Humanities Session 6. At the outset, I'm happy to inform you all that our Evening Degree College is celebrating its Golden Jubilee year. On behalf of our college, we congratulate all the stakeholders responsible for the grand success. Department of English, in association with the Australian National University, Canberra, Australia, and Flame University, Pune, Maharashtra, is organizing this international webinar, Digital Humanities Session 6. I now request Shri Ranjani, final year student, to welcome and introduce all the dignitaries to this international webinar. Happy afternoon to India and a very good evening to Australia. I take this opportunity to welcome you all to this international webinar in association with the Australian National University, Canberra, Australia, and Flame University, Pune, Maharashtra, India. At the outset, I would like to thank all the office bearers of this great institution and welcome all of them. Now, I would like to introduce and welcome our first theme speaker, Katherine, ANU College of Arts and Social Sciences, the Australian National University, Canberra, Australia. Katherine Bode is a professor of literary and textual studies at Australian National University. Her research uses digital collections and platforms to explore the production, circulation, and reception of Australian literature. She is interested in the critical potentials and limitations of quantitative and digital methods for literary studies, a topic that also leads her to consider such things as the nature of archives and future of humanities. Her research explores the critical potentials and challenges of computational literary studies. She is author and co-editor of books including A World of Fiction, Digital Collections, and the Future of Literary History, Advancing Digital Humanities, Research Methods, Theories, Reading by Numbers, Recalibrating the Literary Field, and Resourceful Reading, e-research, the new empiricism and Australian literacy culture. Ma'am, on behalf of Seshadripuram Educational Trust, I wholeheartedly welcome you to this webinar. I am happy to introduce and welcome today's another theme speaker, Dr. Dodd, Associate Professor in Literacy, Literary and Cultural Studies at Flame University. Dr. Maya is Associate Professor in Literacy and Cultural Studies at Flame University. She currently serves as the Assistant Dean for Teaching, Learning and Engagement, as well as the Chair of the Dean Humanities and Languages. Her recent work is featured in Exploring Digital Humanities in India and Media Culture in Transnational. Maya completed her PhD from Stanford University and did subsequent postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Study of Law and Governance at JNU and with the Committee for South Asian Studies at Princeton University. Now, on behalf of Seshadripuram Educational Trust, I welcome you to this webinar. My proud privilege to introduce and welcome Shri W.D. Ashok Sir, Honorary Trustee of Seshadripuram Educational Trust. Sir holds a master's degree in pharmacy, specialized in the field of two-way parenteral nutrition. He served at the famous Al-Amin Hospital, Kuwait, over 13 years. He is Honorary Trustee of Seshadripuram Educational Trust. Sir is the backbone of all the events reflected in our Evening Degree College. We welcome you on behalf of our Evening Degree College and I request you to preside over this webinar, sir. Now, I welcome our beloved principal, Professor N.S. Satish, sir, to this international webinar. Welcome, sir. I welcome all the office bearers and trustees of Seshadripuram Educational Trust and all conveners, volunteers, and all participants who have registered across the globe. Program Coordinator and Rajat PS Coordinator IQAC. And finally, I welcome our own teaching and administrative faculty to this webinar. Thank you, one and all. speaker, Professor Katherine Bode, a New College of Arts and Social Science, the Australian National University, Canberra, Australia, to enlighten us on the topic of scholarly and public engagements with Australian historical newspaper fiction. Over to you, madam.
So today I want to talk about a project that I've been working on for a number of years that exists at the intersection of two major technological systems. And one of them is newspapers in the 19th century, and then there's mass digitisation in the 21st century. And because they come together, it means that we have potential access to a substantial collection of the fiction that was published, circulated and read in Australia in the 19th century. Now, literary historians have always known that newspapers were really vital to publishing and reading fiction in the Australian colonies. And this was because there were few book publishers, lending libraries were accessible to only a very small percentage of the population, and literary journals were very expensive. But there were hundreds of newspapers, and in these cheap and readily available publications, Australians read the vast majority of everything, including fiction. And this might have been a typical family scene of people gathered together to read to each other from a newspaper, perhaps to read a story. But until recently, the size of the newspaper archive, which is hundreds of thousands of editions of hundreds of newspapers, and the lack of any index to them has meant that we've known very little really about what fiction was published there, where it came from, who sourced it, how it was published, and of course how it was received. Now, this situation has changed with the National Library of Australia's digitisation of historical newspapers. It's got over 25 million pages, and it's called Trove, and it's the largest open access collection of historical newspapers in the world. So we're very lucky in that respect. Even though it's very large, of course, it's not complete. When I first started my study in about 2015, I did analysis comparing indexes made for advertisers in newspapers with those digitised to estimate that around 30% had been digitised. And that process is ongoing, so it's larger now, and I'll come back to that a bit later. So this digitisation project makes it possible to explore newspaper fiction for the first time in a large-scale and systematic way. So today what I want to talk about is first how I found the fiction in these newspapers, and then I'll give a few insights into 19th century Australian literary history and the discoveries that this fiction archive enabled. And I'll end with some of the scholarly and other public engagements with this fiction, as well as the opportunities that literary data presents for creating connections between researchers, cultural institutions, and members of the public. So, how did I find fiction in digitised newspapers? Given this is digital humanities, you might imagine that I use some complex machine learning algorithm, but in fact, I began with what will be for all of us a very familiar component of our digital infrastructure, and that's the search box. However, I used it in quite a different way to how we typically approach keyword searching in the humanities. I didn't do what I've done here, which is putting in the author of a fictional work. I also didn't enter the titles of fiction. So you might be able to guess some of the problems that would have come with that approach, but I'll just quickly elaborate them. Firstly, searching for titles and authors would have left me with a lot of irrelevant results to exclude. So you can see here that there's lots of obituaries of Mary Elizabeth Braddon, who's a very famous British writer of sensation fiction. Then you'd have to do the same process with a long list of titles or authors, and more than simply being time-consuming, this approach would be largely self-perpetuating in that you'd only find the authors or the titles that you expected to find, and perhaps most significantly for this context, it wouldn't accommodate the widespread anonymous and pseudonymous publication of fiction, even for famous authors. So instead of searching for titles and authors, I use what I call a paratextual method, and that relies on searching with the words that are commonly used to introduce fiction. And the reason why these words are consistent is because newspaper editors want their readers to go straight away to the page and be able to find the crime reporting or the letters or the fiction straight away. So they make very consistent the paratext that they use. So some of those words are like here, tales and sketches, our novelist, the novelist, but by far the most successful one was chapter. And with this method, I was therefore able to use a technology, the paratext, that was designed for human searching and reading for digital searching and harvesting. So this paratextual method yielded around 200,000 articles, but the format of that data wasn't especially useful for the type of literary history I want to do. You can see here that in the heading field, there's a whole lot of information, including the title, information about where it's published, copyright details, the chapter number and the chapter title. So other records might just have a chapter number, but some of them have a lot more information in this heading field. So what we had to do first was transform what we could extract from Trove into data useful for literary studies. And luckily I was able to hire a bibliographer called Carol Hetherington to help me with this. And we processed the data, and one of the things we had to do was to bring multiple installments of a story under the same heading. So you can see here that this is chapter 8. So that means there's 7 previous articles belonging to that same manifestation of the work. But some of these serial stories might have had 50 or 80 or 100 installments. So there was a lot of work to stitch it together. So after all that data was cleaned up and organised, this is what we had. A little over 21,000 publications of novels, novellas and short stories. And when you consider that prior to this project, the bibliographic record for fiction in 19th century newspapers was under 200. So 16,000 is a big increase. But today I'm just going to concentrate on around 9,000 of these 19th century titles. And by extended fiction, I mean that they were serialised across multiple issues. So what can we learn by exploring this fiction? Let me tell you a bit first about what previously Australian literary historians had thought about 19th century literary culture. There were 3 main ideas about the fiction in newspapers. Firstly, that it was mostly British fiction. Secondly, that it was mostly published in metropolitan newspapers. It was assumed there was very little in provincial papers. And finally, that Australian readers were generally not interested in local writing. So it's been argued, for instance, that the literary tradition of Australia was chronically belated because Australian readers had derivative reading habits, so they just wanted British fiction. So we did find that a substantial amount of the fiction was British. So there's a famous British title that was published in the newspapers, Charles Dickens' Pickwick Papers, but it didn't dominate to the extent that people had assumed. So around 50% of the titles where we were able to identify an author, and that's around 65% of this extended fiction was British, but then around a quarter were Australian, around a fifth were American, and then the remaining 5% came from all sorts of places. And just to give you a sense of the type of fiction published, there was lots of popular fiction by authors that are well known as well as those that are not known today, but there was also works that we would today consider literary or even canonical, and there's some of those authors. So returning to this national or proto-national breakdown, even based on the authors we were able to identify, we found substantially more Australian fiction than had been assumed generally, and a literary culture that was cosmopolitan rather than focused exclusively on Britain. And where metropolitan newspapers were understood to publish pretty much all of the fiction, in fact, the majority of publications appeared in the provincial press, and these are the hundreds of bi- and tri-weekly newspapers that served very small settlements. Provincial newspapers not only published more fiction than their metropolitan counterparts, but they did so in very organised ways. So when we look at the metropolitan context, often newspapers would just publish a story singularly, but in the provincial context, it was often the case that newspapers published the same story in the same sequence around the same time. And this is a visualization of those groupings using a network algorithm. And the thickness of the lines indicates the number of titles they shared in common. Closeness of the newspapers indicates how many of the other newspapers in the same network they share a link with. So these are just excerpts from a broader graph. So using these patterns as a starting point, we found 11 separate newspaper syndication agencies that were operating in the provincial press in the 19th century. And we'd only known about one of those previously. And we found that they operated across multiple colonies and included, up to 70 titles, and large groups of newspapers. So even with the records that we do have, and remember only 30% of the newspapers had been digitised at the time, we can say that these provincial newspaper syndicates were the largest publishers of Australian fiction up until very recently. So these patterns suggest reading communities of a quite different shape to what literary historians had previously imagined. So they thought that Australian literary culture operated with the colonies as almost separate nations. So fiction was published in the metropolitan centre and then sent into the respective colonies. But what we found instead with these provincial syndication networks is that the Australasian provinces had their own largely separate literary culture and that it operated across colonial boundaries. So people in different colonies were reading the same fiction at the same time, including with New Zealand. So while this provincial circulation changes the contours of colonial literary culture in terms of its circulation, the paratext of these stories can also tell us something more specific about what Australian readers were interested in. And you might ask me, what does paratext possibly have to do? How could you know from that what readers were interested in? Well, I think we can say that it's a very important aim of a newspaper editor to sell newspapers. And therefore, it makes sense for them to know what their readers want and also to try and highlight what they think their readers are interested in. So if we just look at 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 paratexts, we might just be getting the ideas of particular editors. But if we look at thousands of paratexts together, we can get a sense overall of what these editors thought their readers would be interested in. And what they seem to have been interested in, or one of the things, is Australian writing. So you can see here some examples where the byline, an original Australian story, or the authorial description, a New South Wales MP or Member of Parliament, chapter titles, A Failure in Melbourne, A New Start in Sydney, and pseudonyms like Old Boomerang signal the local origins of the fiction. And sometimes overseas stories, especially American ones which were not covered by international copyright, were adapted to make them seem like they were Australian. So one story is called Flora Bell's Lover or Rival Bells by American writer Laura Jean Libby. And this is how it was published in multiple Australian newspapers. The Rival Bells of Parramatta. Parramatta is a settlement, one of the first settlements in Australia just west of Sydney. Another story called The American Detective in Russia by Old Sleuth. This was how it was published in multiple Australian newspapers. Barnes, the Australian Detective. And then here are some examples where it's just places in Australia or just the word Australia that is featuring in the titles or the subtitles. And so even though Australian fiction represents only 1/4 of the titles where we know the author, Australia was such a popular word in the paratext that it was the third most popular after story and tale. So we can zoom out as well to consider how the inscription of national or proto-national origins occurred more generally in the paratexts and in the prominent textual features. So what this graph shows us, it's only looking at the fiction where we know the nationality of the authors. And so this group on the far left, that's all American authors. We know they're American. But this is how the fiction was inscribed in the publication event. You can see as 50%, around half was presented as coming from America, but then some was presented as coming from Australia or from somewhere else, and then a substantial amount, 20%, as coming from Britain. So in all of these national categories, fiction was more likely to be represented as coming from where it actually came from than from elsewhere, but American and other fiction were much more likely to be represented as coming from somewhere else or from nowhere in particular. So that's the light blue category, uninscribed, so there's no clear indication where it comes from, than were British or Australian writing, which were equally likely to be inscribed as coming from Britain and Australia, respectively. So this suggests that rather than editors thinking that readers weren't interested in Australian writing, the way that nationality was inscribed suggests that both Australian and British fiction was perceived by editors and syndicators to be of equal value and interest. We've got a relatively short time here, so one of the things I can't talk to you about in detail, how we can use computational methods also to read this fiction, as in to analyse its themes and the ideas in it. So I did do that process. I'm happy to talk about it. We learned some interesting things. What I'm going to move on instead to is the second part of what I was going to talk about, which is this scholarly and public engagement with this fiction. So in 2018, I published a book about this project, available open access. So if you want to know more about it, you can go down and download it. It's all freely open access. And if this was a traditional piece of humanities research, then I could just stop there. I would say, okay, here's the reference list in the back of the book, and you can go and find the sources consulted. They would be like breadcrumbs for future inquiries, but I would leave the maintenance of those breadcrumbs, those resources, to the cultural institutions such as the museums or the galleries, the libraries or the archives that have traditionally looked after our cultural heritage. For this project, I can't just point to Trove newspapers and say, there's the evidence for what I did, because my engagement with that collection and the transformations I've made with the evidence are foundational, are constitutive of the arguments that I made, and including the particular moment in which I looked at Trove, because remember, it's continuing to grow, it's continuing to digitise new newspapers. So also, I've really only just scratched the surface. So you remember I looked at about 9,200 stories in my book, but there were over 21,000, and that's includes thousands of short stories as well as extended fiction that have not ever been discussed. So how can I enable other scholarly engagement, and what are the opportunities for facilitating public literary history? The first thing I did to make this fiction available beyond my research was to create a database. It's also freely open. There's the landing page, so you're welcome to go and have a look. And it makes the full bibliographical and also the full text records of all these stories available for anyone. So you can search it in a variety of ways, typical facets, as well as keyword searching. So you can access it regardless of your level of digital literacy. But if you are a computational researcher, you can also export the whole database and use that for doing text mining or for doing whatever research you do. There are now quite a number of scholarly projects that are using this database. So there are studies that I know of bushfires in Australian fiction, of Aboriginal characters in Australian fiction, of English translations of Russian fiction in Australian newspapers, and also of previously unpublished Gothic or ghost stories. So it's also led to the creation of a book series where previously unpublished works or works that were only published in the newspapers can be published. But what I've been most pleased about has been the opportunity this has given for members of the public to get involved in literary history while also helping to improve the record, especially the errors in optical character recognition that exist in the database, because that is the way the text is created. So optical character recognition, I'll give you a look. You can see here the Great Male Robbery. We as humans can read that. The computer thinks it's the Great male Bob could be. So that's because the algorithm interprets the letters and often makes errors. And there's also gaps in the fiction, because when I did my automatic harvest, sometimes it might pick up chapter 1, 2, 5, 7, 10, but not 3, 4, whichever numbers I didn't mention. So there's lots of opportunities to improve the record. So by making this into a crowdsourcing project, I can link it to the National Library of Australia's text correcting facilities. So what can happen now is members of the public can look in the database and find a story that they're interested in. They can go in and they can correct the text of the story. Once they've corrected it, they can draw the text back into the database. They can add missing chapters to the story just by using the unique article ID that they get from Trove. And they can also add entirely new stories that they find in the newspapers. So since its launch, we've had hundreds of people sign up to correct and to edit fiction. We've also had well over 2,000 new titles added. So that means not only identifying a new title, but adding it and then adding all the many installments that belong to it. So it's been really great fun collaborating with members of the public. It's been excellent receiving emails about things that people are finding, about projects they've been embarking on. Though one of the things about databases is that they're pretty much tied to an individual person, well, in the case of digital humanities databases. So if I lose my job or get hit by a bus or just lose interest in maintaining this database, then all of these records, so what's now actually around 23,000 or so publications would be lost. So to avoid that happening, I made a collaboration with the National Library of Australia. So now that they harvest the fiction in the database, including what is added by members of the public. So now, if you were to go to the National Library of Australia's catalogue and enter the title of a story, you would find it, the newspaper edition would appear alongside other editions. In this case, you've got Red Money by Fergus Hume, and you can see there that there's 3 book editions and there's also the newspaper edition. And in some cases, the record in the newspaper is the only one that is recorded by the National Library, and that's the case with this one. And when you click on the harvested record, you get more detail about the particular publication. You can go and read the story in the newspaper, and as you can see there, you can also go back to the Australian newspaper fiction database and get involved in the project. Yeah, so because Trove is updating these records every week, it means that even if I'm no longer maintaining it, it will still be there for generations of researchers to come. And to my knowledge, this is the first digital humanities project that's completed what we might call the humanities data cycle, which is both drawing on and then feeding back into a national digital collection in ways that enrich, improve the accessibility and coherence of the records. I've also just received some funding to extend the public aspect of this project to create a publishing platform. So at the moment, you can correct the fiction within quite strict parameters that have to stick to how it appears on the newspaper. But what this editing platform will allow is for the text to be drawn out of the database and out of the National Library along with images or maps or other resources, and people can make their own edition of a story, or they can remix different parts of stories. They can add their own commentary, their own introductions, they can add their own pictures, and what they create on that publishing platform will be published and harvested by the National Library of Australia. So now you can have your own book appearing in the National Library's catalogue. So maybe you have your own edition of some title by Dickens in the National Library. So there's the one by the member of the public alongside the Bloomsbury edition, the New York University edition and the Oxford University Press edition. So it's a way of getting public literary history back into the collections. So just to conclude, digital humanities are often seen, at least in Australia, as a little bit like this snake. So this is an illustration from the newspapers, that they're lurking, waiting to pounce and kill the humanities. And the humanities there would be that very dignified couple. And what I hope I've made the case for today is that digital humanities can make a contribution to humanities research within the academy, that it can enhance and improve what we know about literary history. But it can also be used to forge new connections beyond the academy, which sometimes might be equally scary to some academics or equally unlikely between academics and members of the public, or librarians and members of the public, but that I think have a lot of potential for the future of the humanities. My hope is that the digital humanities can think of its collaborations in both directions, towards the cultural institutions and the public, as well as with our colleagues, and in the process build a new form of literary history for the present and the future.
Thank you very much for your insightful theme address, Madam. May I now request theme speaker, Professor Maya Dodd, Associate Professor, Flame University, Pune, Maharashtra, to enlighten us on the topic Digital Cultures and Archives in India. Over to you, Madam.
Thank you so much, Katherine. That was such a fascinating journey through Trove. It's a project that's inspired many of us around the world, and to sort of understand what's possible with its intricacies is even more wonderful. So really appreciate that. I'm going to take you on a slightly different journey. This is one that sort of locates itself more in the future maybe than in the past. And it offers two sort of views. One is perhaps a global, spotlight on what this very scary digital humanities sort of theme is, and more specifically, what is possible. So to sort of begin with, maybe some of us had heard of Trove, maybe some hadn't, but there are some projects which have been ongoing for over a decade now, right? If we think of the beginnings with Google Books, right, that's just about 20 years young, in many ways. But there have been other concomitant efforts in India and around the world, which constitute what we might call today as digital archives. So my talk today will really cover these 5 questions, which are: what are these archives? Where can they be found and how can they be used? What exactly do we get by sort of applying these tools or these texts, in new ways? And as Katherine rightly mentioned, how can we increase that circle of public engagement? Because these are digital formats and platforms, many more people can participate. And finally, why is the study of digital cultures important at all? So I want to begin by just showing you a site that began as a single person initiative. This was actually something that came out of somebody called Anusha Yadav in India. She began by asking people to essentially upload photographs from their personal family, albums to this site called the Indian Memory Project. Since then, this has only grown, right, in terms of scope and scale. One of the most wonderful things about it is the tagging feature. So I can type in, for instance, 1920s, Bombay, and I will find a whole bunch of photographs of that time, which are not necessarily official or licensed. They're often very personal memories. Having said that, I think the growth of other digital spaces is a sort of reinforcement of the instinct of what the Indian Memory Project meant to do. And on their site, they have essentially begun sort of to list these other archives. So obviously we have the big government ones like the National Archives of India or the British Library, right? We have private players like the Asia Art Archive, which looks at a trans-Asian model of collecting, again, documentation on artists and art history. You have something highly specific like the People's Archive of Rural India, looking to document sort of rural village culture that may or may not persist, in terms of going forward. You have traumatic sites like the 1947 archive, Delhi riots, sort of repositories of collective memory, often yes, collective pain, but very necessary as a society to go ahead and, put in one place. Then, of course, more sort of aesthetic things like Indian book covers, of course, even state films, right, through the Films Division of India and such. So just to give you a sense of what all this can look like, I'm listing the link here, but really if you Google Indian Memory Project, it gives you a range of these different websites. What we also see, and I just wanted to maybe add to the Trove story, right, is the way in which digital humanities work is being catalogued around the world. I gave you a sense of what in the Indian context, can be classified as governmental or crowdsourced or digitized. And around the world, there is this wonderful living document called Digital Humanities Around the World. As you can see, the tab which says Australasia, also lists Trove as, one of the top sites in that country. And people keep editing this. People keep adding, right? Like the Digital Harlem, for instance, website and all these different things. A lot of this is an indication of some maybe an offline memory that has been catalogued online. But in the Indian case, what's also perhaps interesting is that there is maybe a contention around the question of what constitutes heritage. So it's not only a question of funding or, what is in perpetuity online, but the very first sort of act of what we call, what we term as heritage. So given that story, what is used and not used, how can we find something, how do we search for something, can be classified across different parameters. Very simply, I have sort of gone ahead and called it full open access, paywall, and partial access. Again, this is a sort of living document that evolves, but certain things you might find in these digital archives online and some things might be fundamentally absent. That is the point at which a different kind of public work begins, right? So to come back to the second story, which was the story of what are the sites to be found, we come to the sort of next stage of not just what's to be found, but what do we need, right? How do we sort of populate, add to, generate, and perhaps remix, much of what's out there. And this is in order that we add to those stories, we complicate those stories, so I think, we are getting a sense of what the digital humanities can do, which is in one sense it can catalog, right, a lot of the knowledges which are either underrepresented or just need to be perhaps formally classified, right, in the digital sphere. The way in which this is done necessarily involves collaboration, meaning that whether it's the act of tagging or what was described in the Trove project as being a crowdsourced kind of editing, right? Kind of like a Wikipedia model. If you don't have an army of people to kind of keep correcting and cleaning up and adding to, right, the data set, there is a sense in which digital archives would fail if they were finite. They need to be constantly evolving. They need to have a whole bunch of people sort of contributing to those in order that they grow, because unlike books and unlike the objects of the analog world, in this case, we are constantly seeing, it's without end, really, in that sense. The third thing that actually is interesting now, which is very different in terms of how this format allows for a whole new mode, is the ability to not just tell new stories, but to kind of render and to render from an individual subject position. So like the Dickens example given, right, your personal copy that can be also added to that collection, there is a recognition that all of our knowledge really exists from the standpoint in which we are located. It's not just this objective way in which, things are transferred. So in order that we make more meaning of that process of translation, the reflective aspect of how certain things are added, deleted, multiplied, is a function of what you can call autoethnography, but really it is the digital storytelling via specific subject positions, right? And this is very dear to the humanities, of course, the act of interpretation, but really it's also about perhaps allowing multiple versions of the same story to exist in parallel. And finally, through all of that, what we end up with really is the ability to represent, right? To represent and to also represent, meaning that there is a sense in which our collective heritage or our collective interest is at stake, right? In terms of why we would do it this way. So having said that, I'd like to show you, two examples of some, of sort of instincts that have manifested in terms of great resource, right, for especially India. One is this digital repatriation project, which was called 2 Centuries of Indian Print. And essentially what it did was digitized about 1,000 books across, the British Library in Bengali, Urdu, and I think Tamil. It's ongoing, actually, the project. where you'd first have had to go to the British Library to access these books. But as of today, at least, especially in the languages, right, where these collections may not be easily accessible even in India, it's a sort of fantastic act that this could have been redone. So obviously one of the big sort of instincts of digital humanities work was to take book history or sort of the circulation of early texts and trace those roots and also create kind of surrogate copies, right, online and such. Now, in addition, and this is where cultural studies enters the story in terms of not just textual study, but sort of a contextual study, we see, like, on the one hand, something like Bichitra, which is this fantastic, collection of all editions and writings, the errata, the mainstream of Tagore's works. And on the other hand, I reference Shouvik Mukherjee's fabulous work, which is that of cataloging this Dutch cemetery, and literally sort of each gravestone and such is identified and uploaded in the database. So it's a map of the cemetery, it's a material site and a set of material objects which are digitized to sort of allow for further study. And that is particularly relevant to us because a lot of, as I said, what is perhaps our heritage or what we call heritage is itself in question. But thankfully, because of the digital, in many ways, it can accommodate the audio, the visual, all kinds of things. Another very, very sort of significant project, I think, is what is out of Ambedkar University. It's the Center for Community Knowledge, which began the memory project of Delhi City. And again, it seems as if these oral history projects should be abundant. But the question is not whether the oral histories have been done, but where do we locate them, right? How do we retrieve them? So if I'm looking for certain, narratives of a certain time period, it becomes difficult until we institutionally organize these stories, and they're doing that with their archival repositories. I'm not sure how else we would, locate them as such. So this comes to this sort of question, right, which is the significant one about how can research now engage public interest. This is not to say, how do I get new audiences for the work? This is to say, how do we collaboratively co-create new knowledge going forward, right? And one of the more interesting things I think about the digital humanities, and of course these digital archives, is a lot of them have nothing to do with the university. The university is, in a sense, the site where we would maximally benefit in terms of in the classroom, the use of these texts. But really it is about the idea of relevance, right? Which is to say, a historical fact or an aesthetic object is not only of interest to students in a classroom. It has significance for societies, right, in terms of how they remember their origin points, not even origin points, but their sort of pasts, because origin points are, of course, very contentious. But even in terms of just accessing those objects itself, this is a great leap forward. I want to sort of put this in for the students who are a little maybe intimidated, right, by the question of what does this do for me? How do I go ahead and sort of pursue this? We're witnessing boom time really for this field, partly because many things that we call DH tools and DH are also sort of overlapping with data science. And there is a sense of the utility of these tools, meaning that there are a lot of courses out there. So this is this is a database in a space called Daria. And in Daria, you can actually look at what are the courses available across different countries, etc., for a master's or something going forward. I think digital humanities is basically the humanities updated, right, in terms of new tools make new things possible. Our questions remain the same, but the way in which we get to those answers change. So similarly, if you look at the Jodhpur, for instance, program in digital humanities also, it's everything from analytics to archiving to heritage, right? Pedagogy, of course, even design. And the fact is that this is a truly collaborative space. So you find your niche in terms of how you want to go forward. That is exactly why this is such a collaborative space and requires collective sort of efforts of many. And this is one of the reasons why Dharti was formed. This is the Digital Humanities Alliance for Research and Teaching Innovations, which is the Indian sort of chapter for locating this interest, right? We're all learning as we go along. This is it's a very fast changing field. So it's not surprising that many winter schools and summer schools are organized in order to teach people some of the tools that might be relevant, right, to doing the kind of text mining or other kind of queries, research queries that we can perform. So that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of need for collective energy in terms of how this can go forward. And as I mentioned, this is the site you can go to, which also has information about future programs in education. But also there is a lot of open source stuff that really exists to learn the tools. I think we live in a time when, whether it's a challenge you have with fixing your bike wheel or something else, we run to YouTube. We're very kind of eager to always look at a tutorial to do certain things. So in the same spirit, I think the can-do attitude of digital humanities allows for the creation of these digital archives, and hence particular sites like the Programming Historian, if you go to this particular channel, also Daria Teach, there's a lot of resource out there to learn how to do stuff. The tools are often also open source, like Night Lab's own like timeline and story maps and stuff. And I just want to briefly show you what some of these tools look like. But basically what I was hoping to sort of show you was the use, not just in terms of, for the classroom, but really for the fact that we, as a collective community of people interested in certain subjects, can together arrange, right, data in terms of these simple sort of, chronologies. So this was a project done, in a class, and I think this is another challenge with digital humanities projects, which is that how do you fund these projects, and at what point do you say the project is done, right? It's not an easy thing at all to, arrive at that. We believe that it's always ongoing. I was lucky that these 3 students of mine continued the work 2 years after the particular course was done. And what they were trying to do was create a repository, which is an open access repository for Indian community cookbooks. In order to sort of identify what a community cookbook is, first of all, there should be an understanding of what were the printed or the other sort of cookbooks circulating, right, at that time. So in the case of, let's say, trying to locate that historically, through this timeline, there is a sense of, okay, this was published in 1831. In fact, this is a function of that British Library mirroring, right, through the 2 centuries of Indian print, that they could even get some of these sources, or 1858, right? So sort of arranging the chronology is easier with the past because of the fact that obviously in terms of print culture, there was much less in terms of quantity. And so the timelines really serve that earlier chronology of arranging, information. This is from the 1880s. As we go on, sort of there is there is still some linking to accessing the original, particularly archive.org and such. But like looking at 1889, this is when like not a royal kitchen cookbook, but a regular cookbook sort of becomes popular. Now, as I mentioned, the historical stuff is good, in terms of arranging sort of earlier data, which was not so prolific. But now when we come to things like handwritten stuff, right, there's all these other tools. So there's handwriting, character recognition, right, just like OCR there for printed texts, which is super useful now when it's coming to Indian languages. So we are witnessing a new era where, in a sense, because of the recognition of fonts, right, across Indian languages, we can now digitize new kinds of information. This one, of course, is in English, but what's also quite fantastic is that you can use Google Translate and such to often get to, translating. So they have transcribed or transliterated sometimes, but it can actually be a clean transcription with a translation into across languages in Google Translate, right? So things like this are possible with kind of really, you could call it student labor, you could call it sort of love for just, a hobby sort of sense of what this is. But essentially these tools are all free, all available, and hopefully should be used by more people than just students. As I mentioned, the story gets more kind of thick and complicated as we go forward in time. So this is where a GIS tool again is useful for saying how many cookbooks of the printed ones are coming out of the south or the north or the west, what is being underrepresented. So the northeast in this case has less representation. So things that allow you to visualize also where the story is located is deeply useful. I wanted to give you a sense of these tools also. As I mentioned, they're free and should be used by many more than just students. In the case of Night Lab particularly, this has been really fabulous. Not just for the timeline stuff, but also across different ways of thinking, arranging information. So they have, for instance, these tools. This one uses sound. This is a storyline which is similar to a timeline but allows for stories. This is a story map where you can again locate information but move it geographically to explain what's going on and such. So these are all free. I really encourage teachers also to really make use of this. And of course, WordPress, right? WordPress is really the gold standard in terms of simple, easy web design. And if you're doing something simple, oftentimes you don't need to pay for the account even. A lot of my students have used WordPress and they've graduated and moved on and everything, but yet because of the fact that this was a free host, the sites remain. And I often joke with them saying that the sites are going to outlive them, so they better be careful what they put out there. But mostly in terms of, again, documenting contemporary history, engaging, right, their own peer groups in terms of these conversations. There was a huge interest in slam poetry, for instance, in many colleges across the country. And so across cities, you had events that, had all kinds of things going on. So you can imagine the reason for this site in terms of filling a real need. Similarly, in terms of children's literature, many of my students, this is essentially a humanities classroom, came in and said, I never really read an Indian book in terms of my growing up years. It was always Enid Blyton or some such. So the question became, why don't we have access? Do they not exist? And they really sat down and did the work in terms of databasing authors and publishers and realizing that no, it's not because there is a lack of, there's a lack of books on Indian content. It's just sort of the recognition of who are these names and such. So, in terms of looking at publishers, looking at names of authors, languages in which they're published, age groups that these books are written for, I think this was almost an act of community service, but very needed, right, for what I think, society requires going forward. We've especially discovered this during times of COVID, where we didn't prepare to go online in any sort of mental sense, but here we are. And it has unleashed a whole new array of possibilities, but it also requires a basic kind of set of infrastructures in place. So whether it's accessing books, whether it's accessing tools, it's important that people have this in place. Now, finally, to get back to that other question, the trickier question, which is that what is digital culture, right? So we understand that digital humanities began as, an interest in the text. And in so doing, over 20 plus years now, there is also the creation of subcultures, you could call them, and other, communities online that constitute, almost nation states unto themselves, right? So to just give you a sense, when you're looking at these numbers, right, just sort of taking a minute to, I think, take this in. The number of users from India, right, whether it's for Facebook or for WhatsApp, right, are the highest in the world. There are less Indian users of Twitter, but fundamentally, we know that social media has changed our public sphere and especially in a way generated a parallel sphere, right? There is a kind of, you could say it's a hologram of real society or it's its own other entity. But the fact of the matter is that this new sphere has its own forms of inscription and of culture. And in that sense, there is another concomitant set of texts, right, which are everything from tweets to posts to, Insta stories and reels, which is a entire corpus of material which is in the born digital realm, meaning this is not a transfer from analog to digital. It's not like the case of, let's say, all of Dickens' collected works or Tagore's collected works, where you're basically collecting paper and digitizing it. This is actually taking place only in the digital sphere, and the biggest sort of perhaps signature, right, of this stuff is that it's often remixed. So you have, whether it's the realm of the meme or other things, the constant recursive referral back to whether it's a digital adaptation of something theatrical or cinematic, but essentially the creation of these new communities of meaning, right, online. And there are many, you could say, academic queries also that can be made of this work. So I listed some of the questions that can be looked at, right, in terms of the born digital. And of course, right, you have the question of heritage online, you have the question of pedagogy online. Of course, in terms of textual scholarship, there is a whole variety of possibilities that can be actualized. And then we also have these other kind of, collateral questions, which have to do with digital civil rights, right, civil liberties. And this is about, for instance, free speech, or hacktivism, or ethical challenges. And of course, the sort of very robust space of open source culture. And there's a lot of other stuff that's also the kind of the positives online, which include the creation of digital artwork and a whole new aesthetic that's emerging. This is really significant for the fact that if you understand that 70% of India is under the age of 30, right? And if it's a population of 1.3, that next billion is not just that demographic of under 30, but it's also what Google is calling the next billion, meaning that there are entire audiences waiting to be monetized, commercialized, and also tapped into, right, in terms of the language diversity, the creation of these new cultures. To give you, just a broad sense, right, if you have 200 million Bengali speakers, or, sort of different language speakers of that variety, these are robust cultures that are having their kind of translation moment into the digital. So the kind of intellectual and, academic query that can come of these digital cultures is very, very significant going forward. And so the need perhaps to address those questions is what we are trying to do with the with this idea of digital cultures. So I mean, in a very simple way, I hope that I have covered the ground that I began with, which was that we're looking at why digital archives, how does that play into digital humanities, what is possible with that, and finally the fact that digitality exceeds not just our academic study, but literally it's constituting our lives. So for many, many reasons, it also affords new possibilities for the public humanities and for, just intellectual life going forward. So I hope that this has answered some questions, and I'm happy to share many more resources going forward. Thank you.
Thank you for the insightful speech, ma'am. Now the floor is open for the interaction. As we are running out of time, we take up only few questions which we have received from registration form and chat box. I request Vinay Sagar sir to moderate the interaction session.
Question for Katherine, ma'am. Can we equate the pleasure of reading manual newspapers with reading of digital newspapers?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say that this type of reading that these people were doing in the 19th century might not have felt very pleasurable for what we imagine as the pleasure of reading. So when we think about our technology of analog text, we think maybe of snuggling in bed with something that we can hold in our hand. These newspapers were huge pieces of paper that had quite narrow columns, and there might be 15 to 20 tiny columns on a page. And sometimes in one edition of the newspaper, they had 60,000 word novels. So you can imagine, like, reading like this, I don't think it would have been that pleasurable. And to push on the other side, I actually find the correcting of text in the digital one strangely addictive, because some of these stories, even if they fade a bit sometimes when the person who was writing them got tired or had too quick a deadline, you can then go to the interest of the working out the characters. So I think that, they all media have their pleasures, don't they? But I wouldn't have wanted to read these in the original newspapers very much.
Ma'am, one more question. Ma'am, in future, can we ban manual newspapers and shift it completely to digital newspapers, ma'am?
Well, I think in Australia that's almost happened. You see newspapers in the newsagent, but with COVID, I think probably that's even more declined. There has been a resurgence though in print magazines, hasn't there, with people sort of reclaiming that online space. So I think that, through the whole of history of textuality and technology, we've had lots of technologies coexisting. So, it wasn't like the manuscript was then print came along and there were no more manuscripts, or, things have coexisted. And and inform each other. And, a lot of the ways we read newspapers online now actually have their basis in, consistency of paratext and all these sorts of techniques that worked out with the print form. So maybe the print will always be with us, even if we're not reading it.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, the question for Maya ma'am. Maya ma'am, can I? What educational policies and systems should we adopt to emerging technologies and the new digital culture, ma'am?
Yeah, no, I think we've been thrust into the adoption of digital technologies, right? Without, as we said, any preparation really. And, in India, definitely there are serious challenges, right, with digital divide, with the idea of access. And, the point is that we never realized the need we ever had for these technologies. It's like saying, these tools have existed for many years, but until this pandemic kind of caused us to migrate, we haven't felt the need to do so. Now that we're there, and certainly in terms of jobs and whatnot going forward, let's not pretend that there is not a jobs crisis in this country. It's very real. People want to feel like they're ready for the 21st century workforce. I think education has to, in some sense, kind of take these tools in tandem, not just to teaching content, but to teaching skill. So I'm not saying that the goal of digital humanities is to skill up, right, to get more, used to newer tech. But it's just to sort of say that, hey, there may be many ways to ask the same question. And there's nothing wrong in learning, of these other sets of tools which exist and are not necessarily challenging to get to. So for those reasons, I hope, and of course, even NEP, the new education policy and such, has focused on this idea of skilling and whatnot. But really, it's a good and heartening news that even the UGC in India has taken digital humanities into the curriculum. And it is not as esoteric as it might have sounded maybe a few years ago, such that it will be a elective offering or a paper at the very least, right, in most institutions in the country. So I think it's good times going forward in terms of all of us, I think, skilling up and, together.
Thank you, ma'am. One more question. Traditional means of communication, whether it is dying as a result of digital culture, ma'am?
I know this was always a big, thing. Anytime some new technology comes, there's always the fear of the old one going, right? But I appreciate what Katherine said, which is they usually coexist. And in fact, the modalities of the old come into the new, right? So all the young people are leaving Facebook because it's become the joint family, sort of place where too many questions are being asked and all those uncomfortable questions are also, So in that sense, of course, we don't evacuate our social modes, right, in terms of the formal ways in which we inhabit these spaces. Our social being is what drives, I think, our lives in these digital formats also. And it's not in opposition to or radically against. Yes, there's a lot more anonymity, which is interesting for the future of how we might create online tribes, right, digital tribes. Because obviously we are still very tribal, as a species. But in every sense, I don't see them really as having cancelled each other out. That's kind of not the way.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thanks to all the speakers.
Vinay sir,
Yes, sir.
just a minute.
Yes,
This is for Katherine ma'am. What are the roles of newspapers in nation building, ma'am?
Yes, I think there's been a long time argument, hasn't there, in literary and cultural studies about the nation being, in a way, formed from the newspaper. And I think that, at least in the Australian context, what the research with these newspaper fictions shows is that there were sort of multiple proto-nations emerging, with the way that the circulation was not across the continent, nor was it within the governmental forms that existed. It was surpassing those and changing those. So I guess I would question Anderson's thesis and wonder whether it was maybe a little teleological that the nation was there and therefore he saw the newspapers. Maybe it's a bit more complicated.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Katherine ma'am and Maya ma'am. Over to Nagsudha ma'am.
Thank you very much, respected speakers, for answering the questions to the participants. A small announcement before presidential remarks. We will all meet up in the next international webinar organizing by Nisargamitra Eco Club of our college in association with University of San Francisco, California, US on the topic Essence of Religious Education to Conserve Environment on 29th March 2021. We will now send the feedback form link in the chat box as well as to your registered mail ID, which will be active for next 48 hours. Kindly fill the same and send back for e-certificates. The e-certificates will reach you from 7 to 10 days. May I now request Sri W.D. Ashok Sir, Honorary Trustee, Seshadripuram Educational Trust, to render presidential remarks.
Good evening to everyone. From the Seshadripuram Evening Degree College, from the Department of English, bringing together the Australian National University, Canberra, and also the Flame University. I would like to thank Katherine Madam and Maya Madam, who have given a complete note of their respective topics regarding humanities, which was the aim for the Digital Humanities Series 6, which was done by the Evening Degree College. And I just want to say that Katherine Madam was telling about the newspapers and how from the 19th century, how the publishers and how it was published and how the archives and different public interest towards metropolitan type of newspapers when compared to the rural newspapers then, and how important it was the newspapers at that moment of time, and how the digital importance has come over now. She has given a wonderful understanding between the two and correlated between the two technologies at the same time. Newspaper had their own roles at that moment of time in the 19th and 20th century, but today's role, it has come down drastically, and the 21st century is totally a technology oriented one, which she has mentioned. At the same time, Maya Madam, from her talk, she has given what are actually the archives, the culture of Indian heritage, and how actually the public interest towards the digital tools have to be improved. And actually she gave the Indian Memory Project, how it is being done and how it can be utilized for different aspects of different project works. At the same time, how art can be tagged towards the bringing up the project work also she has mentioned. And she gave a wonderful understanding of Center of Community Learning, how, for example, in Delhi citizens, memory projects are being taken up and how it can be preserved. And also she said about the Dharti, the practicing digital assess, how it can be brought about, and how actually the different languages also can be bringing about digitality in their own specific languages. And she gave some examples regarding the Bengali language and also cuisines or the different delicacies of different parts of the states. For example, in India, how different cultures are being adopting and how digitalization can be improved in these aspects. I would like to say that how people influence technology means I just want to say how people influence technology and in turn technology influences people. This has become the aspect in the digital cultures in humanity nowadays. It will be like designing new experience and create a unique mold. In India, intangible ways of cultures are there, and you can actually see wherein the technology is recorded and the events which is happening for thousands of years have been recorded at the same time. But at the same time, how this digital technology is being helped also, and how the government also is taking up the stance in bringing about digital humanities, and also how the digital culture in the present form is being also maintained in India becomes very important. For example, I can just quote from the government point of view, Museums of India, there are 4 national digital missions which are being taken up. And national, first one, I can just say National Mission of Manuscripts. That is how olden days papers and the manuscripts are being digitalized, and at the same time how National Mission for Monuments and Antiquities or articles are being taken up. The third, National Mission for Libraries are being taken up, how digitalization can be done. At the same time, Gandhi Heritage Site missions for different aspects of monuments and other places are being taken up. On the whole, I just want to say that Seshadripuram Evening Degree College, with their Digital Humanities Series 6, have completed different aspects of humanities, and they have completely done a wonderful way. I would like to thank Dr. Satish, Rajat, and Darapa sir, and all the coordinators who have come up with this wonderful event of webinar. I thank one and all for their participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presidential remarks, sir.
Can we conclude now?